With today being halfway to Halloween, I'm going to show you how I transform this foam sheet into a realistic looking brick. This is actually the first time I've used this type of foam, so let's see if I can achieve the result I'm looking for, or if I will completely mess it up. I started off by going to my local Lowe's and picking up 4 sheets of 2x2 1-inch insulation board. Now the one I got happened to be in this greenish color, however if you find one that comes in pink, don't worry, they're the exact same thing. And now I wanted this brick to look just like the brick that's on the side of my house, so I started off by taking some pictures and tracing out some of the shapes from the actual brick that was on the side of my house, and then transferring those brick patterns to paper. Once I had the brick pattern traced onto the paper, I could then cut it out and then use those bricks as templates to trace onto the foam. Something I made sure to do when I was tracing the patterns was to make sure each piece was cut 1 inch short. That way I could overlap each corner, and because each piece of foam was 1 inch thick, that extra inch on each side would be covered by the thickness of the foam. So because I wanted each panel to be 16 inches wide, I actually cut them all at 15 inches and then just overlap the ends. The next part was actually the most difficult. I had to cut out all the lines I had just traced to represent the mortar in between the bricks, and I had started out by using a Dremel and even trying different bits to put on the Dremel, and none of them were really working very well. It was almost just kind of melting the foam, so I ended up doing an alternative where I just went really carefully with an X-Acto knife, and then I actually used a flathead screwdriver to basically pluck out all of the foam in between the bricks. Now this definitely wasn't the best way to carve out the foam, however it did technically work, it just took a little bit of extra time. Then I repeated the carving on the next 3 pieces, and the hardest part was finally out of the way. Now I could finally put all 4 pieces together and finally get a feel for what the shape of this brick pillar would be like. Pretty much any type of glue would work on this foam, however I ended up using epoxy because I wanted just a little bit of extra strength to make sure the pieces stayed together. Then I just did some light weathering with my X-Acto knife, kind of carving out the edges of some of the bricks to smooth them out, or adding in some crack lines on some of the other bricks just to vary it up a little bit. And then I finally got to the easiest part of this process, which is actually heat treating the foam. Now the heat treating is the most important part of this project to make the foam look like brick, because even just a little bit of heat starts to crumple up the foam and make it really rough, giving it that good brick texture. After that was time for paint. Now I had decided to use spray paint on this foam, even though those two usually don't mix well together. So I was really careful on the first few layers, and it was turning out pretty well. However, once I got towards the end, it started to really eat away at the foam and it wasn't looking super great. Since the spray paint started to eat away at the foam, I decided to use textured paint to coat the top panel pieces that would represent some stone. This was also the same paint I used to coat my Half-Life 2 Ravenholm cross that I made a few years ago. And I'm actually glad I decided to use this paint for this part, because it actually makes a nice contrast between the brick texture and the stone texture on top. One thing I didn't show here was me painting a few of the bricks to match that brick wall on the side of my house, because they're not all red. Some of them are a little bit more tan, some are gray, some are black, so I went through with that before I did any other weathering. I started by doing sort of the Bob Ross technique of tapping my brush into the paint. However, after I got the paint on the brush, I actually tapped a lot of it off. That way when I put it on the bricks, it wouldn't be super heavy. I want to start with a really light coating of the weathering, because it's way easier to add more than try to cover it up. So I started with light layers throughout each side, kind of brushing over to smooth everything out, and went little by little over each side. I did a few different passes of just black, then a mix of black and green, and then one that was pretty heavy on the green to kind of represent some moss that's growing on the sides of the bricks. I also made sure to make each side asymmetrical because you don't want it to look exactly the same on each side. Some sides have some drips on them, another side has kind of like a scorch looking mark, or like I'll go into some of the cracks and kind of highlight them a little bit more, or put a little bit more dark color there to make some details pop more than others. After that, the last piece to weather was the stone plate on top. Now I started off with a light black coating around the edges and over the very top, but I went very, very lightly because at first I didn't want it to look like weathering. I almost wanted it to just highlight some of the texture on top. However, after I went through a light pass over the edges and the top, I went back in and added in some more details of some cracks or one side that is really dirty, again just to make it asymmetrical so everything doesn't look exactly the same. And this is what each side looks like after weathering. I think it came out really good. And now you could stop here at this weathering stage. However, there was one more thing I wanted to do. If you remember when I did the spray paint, one of the sides turned out really bad. And you can really start to see that blue-green color from the foam coming through the paint. So what I wanted to do for that one side was actually add some fake moss to it to cover up that color. So all I did to cover that up was I added some super glue to that side, and then I have a bag of fake moss that I just tapped onto the super glue to make sure it would stick to the right spot. And then after that, it was finally done. So please let me know in the comments of what you think of my foam brick pillar. Let me know if you guys have any other tips or tricks that you like to use, or if you have any other questions about how I made it. And then also, coming up hopefully soon, I am going to be making an animatronic from scratch, a homemade animatronic of a Half-Life 2 head crab zombie. So stay tuned for that one.